welcome to the Lonely Star.
Mm.
Today, we're diving into some really, really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
You shared some research with me regarding European security,
Yeah.
specifically NATO.
Right.
And based on what you found,
Mhm.
it seems like this alliance that's been around for so long is being reevaluated.
Mhm.
And that could have some pretty big consequences for how we view global stability as a whole.
Yeah, and one of the first things that jumped out to me from what you shared was this idea of an internal rebalancing.
Hmm.
The U.S. role in NATO has been so central
Right.
for decades.
Absolutely.
And your sources hint at this scenario where some of the major European powers are considering a future where maybe Europe contributes more,
Yeah.
even takes a leading role.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what's going on there. What's
The Nordic nations are all seemingly at the table.
Yeah.
They're talking about potentially taking on a larger role within NATO,
Huh.
a role that the U.S. currently occupies.
Yeah.
And I think the core question here that we need to try to answer is what's driving this initiative?
Right.
Like what's underneath all of this?
Yeah.
What are the anxieties, the ambitions that your sources point to?
Well, from what you've gathered, it really seems like the fear of the U.S. just up and leaving NATO is a huge factor. That possibility, however likely or unlikely it might be that the United States would just, significantly reduce its commitment to the alliance,
Right.
that seems to have pushed some of these European capitals to think about, okay, what are our other options?
Right.
What other arrangements can we make?
Right.
And I'm curious, from all the reading you've done, have you thought about what European security would actually look like if they weren't relying on the U.S. as much?
I mean, it's such a wild scenario. Right.
Like it's not something that's really been front and center for a long time.
No.
The U.S. has always been the bedrock in a sense.
Yeah, yeah.
But, if this concern about the U.S. pivoting away is really the driver, what are these European powers actually considering doing? Your research mentions this phrase, a managed transfer of responsibility. Like, what does that actually mean in real terms?
So what your sources point to is that there are these informal discussions happening.
Okay.
And the goal is to put together a proposal for a phased handover. And a key part of this would be firm commitments.
Yeah.
Public commitments to ramp up their own defense spending and military capabilities.
Okay.
And what I find really interesting is this isn't just talk.
Yeah.
Your research shows that countries like Germany, France, the UK,
Right.
they've already started taking steps in this direction. They're increasing their defense budgets. And you see more military cooperation happening at the EU level. So there's definitely something brewing.
Yeah.
But it's not like everybody's on board with this.
Yeah. That's a really important point from what you've shared.
Yeah.
The countries on NATO's eastern flank, places like the Baltics, Poland, Romania,
Right.
they seem much more hesitant about all of this.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, it seems like their main worry is that even just talking about Europe taking a bigger role might actually make the U.S. leave faster. Like it's this self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it really reveals a lot about how they view their own security.
Yeah.
They see the U.S. security umbrella as the ultimate guarantee.
Right.
It's what they rely on.
Yeah. It's a real dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like you have these major European powers getting ready to maybe stand on their own 2 feet more. And then you have these other countries who are basically saying, no, we need the U.S. here.
Right.
We don't even want to talk about them leaving.
Exactly.
And it makes you wonder what the U.S. thinks about all of this. Your sources say that the U.S. role in European security right now is indispensable.
That's right. And your research highlights some really crucial areas where the U.S. plays a unique role. Things like their nuclear deterrent,
Right.
significant military capabilities that a lot of European allies just don't have on their own.
Yeah.
And, of course, a large number of U.S. troops stationed across the continent.
Yeah.
So if the goal in the long term is to have this gradual handover of responsibility,
Yeah.
what do you think is motivating the U.S.? What's in it for them? Your sources mention a strategic rebalancing towards Asia.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, it sounds like maybe the U.S. is shifting its priorities. But, given how important their role is in Europe right now,
Yeah.
do your sources give any indication that they would actually agree to this managed transfer idea?
Well, that's a very sharp question. And to be honest, your sources suggest that there's really no guarantee at all that the U.S. would sign off on such a structured process.
Right. I mean, international relations are complicated.
Yeah.
Domestic politics in the U.S. are complicated.
Right.
And trying to make these kinds of long-term commitments in such a fluid global environment is inherently uncertain.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how permanent can any security arrangement really be?
It really does. Yeah, it feels like we're trying to make sense of a puzzle where all the pieces are moving at the same time.
Right.
But let's go back to the eastern flank for a minute. We talked about their reluctance to even discuss the U.S. stepping back.
Yeah.
But your research really emphasizes their strong preference for staying under U.S. protection.
Right.
So what's behind that sentiment? In countries like Poland, the Baltics, Romania, what are they specifically anxious about, according to your sources?
Well, your research makes it clear that their concern about Russia is very real. And it makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
They're right next door geographically.
Right. And they have this history with Russia that definitely shapes how they see things.
Yeah.
And there's a really telling detail you found. Romania actually turned down France's offer to extend its nuclear umbrella, which really shows you where their trust lies.
Yeah.
When they think about a worst-case scenario, they're not looking to France for protection.
Right.
And it suggests that the threat of potential Russian aggression really weighs heavily on their minds, more than other potential security guarantees.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And, one country that features prominently in your research is Poland, particularly their upcoming presidential election.
Right.
It seems like this domestic political event could have huge international consequences.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation.
Yeah, why is this Polish election so crucial? According to your sources?
Well, what your research suggests is that the outcome of this election could really sway Poland's allegiances within NATO. One scenario your sources lay out is that if a certain political faction wins,
Poland might move closer to France and embrace these European-led security initiatives.
Right.
But if the other side wins, then Poland might stick with a stronger, more direct relationship with the U.S. And given Poland's location on that eastern flank, any shift in their orientation could really change the balance of power within NATO and have a real impact on the future of European security.
Right.
It's a perfect example of how domestic politics can spill over onto the global stage.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of this term that popped up in your research, cordon sanitaire.
Right.
Which has all sorts of historical baggage.
Yeah.
So in this context, what does it mean, according to your sources?
Well, as I understand it from your research, this cordon sanitaire refers to a potential scenario where NATO's eastern flank essentially becomes a zone of sustained U.S. influence. And your sources suggest this could serve two purposes.
Okay.
First, it allows the U.S. to keep a strong strategic foothold in this really vital part of Europe.
Even if they decide to focus on other parts of the world.
Right.
And second, it could act as a buffer zone, keeping Western Europe and Russia at a distance.
So basically, we're talking about a future where Europe isn't this unified security bloc.
Yeah.
It's more fragmented.
Exactly.
And your research outlines 3 conditions that would need to be in place for this kind of divergence to actually happen, where Western Europe takes care of itself militarily, and the East stays aligned with the U.S.
Right.
So what are these crucial factors?
Well, the first one your research highlights is that those Central and Eastern European countries need to keep seeing Russia as a serious threat.
Okay.
A credible threat.
Right.
The second condition is that those countries would need to trust the U.S. more than they trust the EU or any individual Western European power when it comes to security.
Right.
And the third really important element is that the U.S., for its own strategic reasons, doesn't completely abandon Europe. They can't just withdraw everything. So if these 3 things basically hold true, then this scenario where Western Europe goes its own way militarily and the East stays with the U.S., that becomes a much more plausible future.
So it all comes down to threat perception, who you trust, and the strategic calculations of these global players.
Right.
But to really understand all of this, we need to consider Russia's point of view. Your research mentions their stated intentions regarding NATO.
Yeah.
So what do they say they want, according to your sources?
Well, from what you found, Russia publicly claims that they have no plans to invade NATO, which really throws a wrench into the whole threat of assessment.
Right.
Because it shows you how differently countries within the alliance view the situation.
Yeah.
The Eastern members feel very vulnerable.
Right.
But this statement from Russia that they're not planning any aggression, it leads other parts of the alliance to question whether a strong U.S. military presence in the East is really necessary. You know, it raises questions about why those troops are there.
Yeah.
And about whether NATO is really unified in its purpose.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like for some countries, is a fear of the U.S. changing its commitment to NATO a bigger concern than the actual threat from Russia?
It's possible.
Yeah. But, you know, even with all of these potential shifts and realignments, your research also emphasizes how important NATO is as an institution. It's not like the whole security structure would just disappear.
Right.
Even if the U.S. takes a step back.
And that's a crucial point to remember.
Yeah.
NATO, as it exists right now, provides some really significant advantages. You know, it's been around for decades.
Yeah.
It has these established military planning procedures, clear command structures.
Right.
And the bedrock of that Article 5 collective defense agreement.
Yeah.
So even if the U.S. becomes less dominant in the future, this existing infrastructure is really valuable. It gives Europe a foundation for continued security cooperation.
Yeah.
Trying to build something like that from scratch would be a huge undertaking.
Absolutely.
It would be incredibly complex, take forever.
Yeah.
And there's a real risk of instability.
Yeah. So after this deep dive, it's clear that the future of European security and NATO is really up in the air. These ongoing discussions.
Yeah.
The different national interests.
Right.
Even events like the Polish election. These things could have huge, long-lasting consequences.
Absolutely.
For how the world works geopolitically.
And what your sources really highlight is that there's a real possibility that this transatlantic security architecture could be reshaped. You know, this idea of Western Europe becoming more strategically autonomous while the East stays aligned with the U.S.
Yeah.
It raises some really fundamental questions about stability on the continent.
Right.
And about that delicate balance of power.
It really makes you think. You know, given all of this information and the different scenarios that your research lays out, what do you see as the most likely path forward for NATO? And is there one factor that you think will be the most decisive? It's definitely something to ponder, even after our conversation today is over. So thank you for joining us on The Lonely Star and for sharing these incredible insights.
Good of hand.
Join us next time for another deep dive into the unexpected corners of our world. Goodbye for now. The truth is stranger than fiction.